The sledgehammer broke through the concrete wall on the third swing, revealing darkness that exhaled air so cold and stale it made Julian Carter's breath catch. His 10-year-old daughter Mia stepped back instinctively, her hand finding the flashlight she'd been holding while her father worked, both of them understanding without words that what they'd just opened had been sealed deliberately, had been waiting decades for someone desperate enough to tear down walls in a building the world had abandoned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Julian peered through the gap, his headlamp illuminating what appeared to be stairs descending into the pulp mill's foundation, steps that weren't on any blueprint he'd found, that didn't appear in the county building records or the foreclosure documentation. The mill had been built in 1923, had operated for 60 years processing timber into paper pulp, had employed hundreds before cheaper foreign production made it obsolete. It had sat empty since 1985, accumulating tax liens and structural damage, becoming the kind of property counties seized and couldn't sell until someone desperate enough came along. That someone was Julian, who'd purchased the Riverside Pulp Mill for $395 at a tax auction, seeing it not as industrial heritage but as salvage material he could sell to keep himself and Mia fed for another few months. The construction company he'd worked for had collapsed in July, his unemployment had run out in September, and November's rent was due in 5 days with his bank account showing $18 and no prospects for income beyond whatever he could extract from the mill's bones. The building was massive, maybe 40,000 square feet across 3 levels, its brick walls solid despite decades of weather and neglect. The machinery had been salvaged long ago by people with better timing and more resources, but the structure itself held value: copper wiring, cast iron pipes, old-growth timber framing, architectural details that reclamation yards would pay for if Julian could remove them without getting hurt or caught trespassing. The county had sold it explicitly for demolition, had made Julian sign paperwork acknowledging the building was unsafe and that he assumed all liability for whatever happened while salvaging it. He'd spent 3 days carefully removing accessible materials, working methodically while Mia did homework in the truck or helped sort hardware into containers. She'd become adept at salvage work over the past 6 months, had learned which metals were valuable and how to stay out of the way when her father was doing dangerous work. They'd developed a rhythm born of necessity, the kind of teamwork that emerges when it's just 2 people against circumstances that don't care about fairness or effort. The concrete wall Julian had been demolishing was in the mill's basement level, part of what the blueprints showed as foundation. But the wall had sounded hollow when he'd tested it, had seemed too deliberately placed to be purely structural. He'd started breaking through out of curiosity mixed with the desperate hope that maybe there was more salvageable material hidden in spaces other scavengers had missed. Now he stood looking at stairs that descended into darkness deeper than the building's official foundation should allow, at a space that had been sealed so completely that even the air felt preserved, untouched by the decades that had reduced the mill above to ruin. "Should we go down there?" Mia asked, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when she was scared but didn't want to admit it. Julian considered this, weighing safety against curiosity against the fact that he'd paid $395 for this building and needed to extract every possible dollar of value from it. "Stay here. I'll check it out first, make sure it's safe." He descended carefully, testing each step before committing his weight, his headlamp revealing brick walls and timber supports that looked far older than the mill itself. The stairs ended in a chamber maybe 20 feet square, its ceiling supported by massive oak beams, its walls lined with shelving that held wooden crates and metal boxes covered in decades of dust. Julian's hands trembled as he opened the first crate, finding it packed with something wrapped in oiled cloth. He pulled back the fabric, revealing bars of metal that caught his headlamp beam and threw back golden light. Not brass, not copper, the weight was wrong, the color too pure. He pulled out his phone, shaking now, and searched for images that would confirm what his racing mind was suggesting. Gold bars. Stamped with dates from the 1920s and 30s, marked with assayer's marks he didn't recognize but which looked official, substantial. The first crate held 12 bars, each one maybe 10 pounds, each one worth, Julian's mind struggled with math that seemed impossible, maybe $20,000 at current gold prices. 12 bars meant $240,000 in one crate. He opened another crate, finding more bars. And another. And another. The shelves held 23 crates total, each one packed with gold wrapped in cloth that had preserved it perfectly in the sealed chamber's stable environment. Julian sat on the cold floor trying to calculate wealth that exceeded anything his family had ever possessed across generations, trying to process that he'd purchased this building for $395 and had just found what appeared to be millions of dollars in gold bullion hidden in its foundation. "Dad?" Mia's voice came from the top of the stairs, worried by his silence. "Stay there, sweetheart. I'm okay, just checking something." Julian forced himself to breathe, to think clearly despite adrenaline and shock. He photographed everything with his phone, documented the crates and their contents, tried to establish evidence of what he'd found before touching anything else. Then he searched the chamber more carefully, looking for papers or documentation that would explain why someone had hidden a fortune in gold beneath a pulp mill and then sealed it so thoroughly that 40 years of abandonment hadn't revealed it. He found the answer in a metal box on the lowest shelf, protected by wax seals that had kept moisture out. Inside were papers, ledgers, and a letter written in fountain pen on stationery that had Riverside Pulp Mill letterhead from 1933. "To whoever finds this chamber, my name is Walter Brennan, and I am the owner of Riverside Pulp Mill. I am writing this because I am dying, because my sons have proven themselves unworthy of the fortune I've built, and because I believe wealth should go to someone who earns it rather than inherits it through accident of birth. The gold in this chamber represents 40 years of careful profit, of refusing to trust banks that failed during the Depression, of converting wealth to tangible assets I could control. I built this pulp mill from nothing, employed hundreds of men through good times and bad, created something that mattered beyond simple profit. My sons see only the money, only the inheritance they believe they're owed, only the lifestyle they expect to maintain without having earned it. They are wastrels and fools. Gerald drinks and gambles, has already squandered every dollar I've given him. Thomas married a woman who spends faster than he can steal from company accounts. Neither has worked an honest day, neither understands that wealth is built through labor and patience and refusing to quit when circumstances make quitting seem reasonable. I'm sealing this gold beneath my mill because I won't leave it to sons who'd waste it within a year. Instead, I'm leaving it for whoever is desperate enough to buy this building when it's worth nothing, whoever is willing to work hard enough to tear down walls and search thoroughly enough to find what I've hidden. That person, whoever they are, whenever they come, will have demonstrated the qualities my sons lack. They'll have shown they understand work and perseverance and the determination required to extract value from things the world has abandoned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gold is legally yours if you find this chamber. I've consulted lawyers who assure me that treasure found on legitimately purchased property belongs to the finder, assuming the original owner can't be identified or has been dead long enough that claims have expired. I'll be dead by the time you read this, probably decades dead. My sons will have inherited the mill and likely lost it through neglect or debt. The gold will have waited patiently for someone worthy. Use it wisely. Build something that matters. Don't waste it the way my sons would have. You've earned it by being willing to work when work was required, by searching when others gave up, by refusing to accept that abandoned buildings hold nothing of value. Walter Brennan, October 15, 1933. Julian read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking, his mind trying to process implications that seemed too enormous to be real. He'd bought this building for $395 because he was desperate for salvage income to pay rent he couldn't afford. He'd found a fortune because he'd been thorough, had broken through a wall others had probably assumed was solid foundation, had descended stairs that led to wealth beyond anything he'd imagined possible. He climbed back up carefully, emerged into the basement level where Mia was waiting with barely controlled patience. She took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "What's down there?" Julian knelt to her eye level, choosing honesty because she deserved truth about circumstances that would affect both their lives. "Gold. A lot of gold. More money than I can really process right now." Mia's eyes widened, her 10-year-old mind trying to grasp what this meant. Like treasure? Exactly like treasure. The man who built this mill hid it in 1933, left a letter saying whoever found it earned it by being willing to work hard enough to discover it. Julian paused, making sure she understood. This changes everything for us, Mia. No more worrying about rent or food or whether I can afford to fix the truck. Everything changes. But even as he said it, Julian's mind was already moving to complications. Gold this valuable would attract attention, would raise questions about legitimacy and taxes and whether he actually had legal right to keep it. Walter Brennan's letter claimed it was legal, but that was one dead man's assertion from 1933. Julian needed to verify before he touched anything else, needed to understand what he was actually dealing with before making choices he couldn't undo. That evening, after securing the basement entrance and getting Mia settled with dinner at their cramped apartment, Julian called the only lawyer he knew, a public defender named Marcus Thompson who'd helped him navigate the bankruptcy filing 2 years ago when medical debt from Mia's emergency appendectomy had overwhelmed them. Marcus listened to the story with the professional patience of someone who'd heard stranger things, then asked Julian to send photographs of the letter and the gold. "Give me 24 hours to research this," Marcus said. Treasure trove law is complicated, varies by jurisdiction, and involves questions about abandonment and original ownership. But if Walter Brennan's letter is authentic, if the gold has been there since 1933, if his estate was settled and the property eventually went to tax foreclosure, you probably have legitimate claim. The question is how to establish that claim without triggering problems you can't handle. Julian spent that night researching Walter Brennan, finding obituaries and historical records that confirmed the basic story. Brennan had indeed owned Riverside Pulp Mill, had died in 1934, had been survived by 2 sons who'd inherited his business. The mill had operated for another 50 years before closing, had passed through several ownership changes, had eventually been seized by the county for unpaid taxes after the last owner abandoned it in the 1990s. The Brennan family line was harder to trace, but Julian found enough to suggest Walter's sons had indeed squandered their inheritance. Gerald Brennan had died in 1952, bankruptcy records showing he'd lost everything through gambling debts. Thomas Brennan had lasted longer but ended similarly, dying in 1971 with nothing to pass on to his own children. The family had scattered, disappeared into the kind of obscurity that comes from wealth lost and names forgotten. Which meant Walter's gold had sat untouched for 90 years, waiting in a sealed chamber beneath a building that changed hands and purposes and eventually was abandoned entirely, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy it for salvage and thorough enough to break through walls others had assumed were solid. Marcus called the next morning with cautiously optimistic news. "The law in this state supports your claim. Treasure found on property you legitimately own belongs to you, assuming the original owner is dead and their estate was properly settled. Walter Brennan died in 1934, his estate was settled then, and there's no indication anyone has legal claim to assets that weren't discovered during probate. The gold was hidden, was never listed in estate inventory, was sealed in a chamber that wasn't discovered until you found it. So it's mine? Legally, probably yes. But there are complications. You'll need to report it as income, pay taxes on the fair market value. That's substantial, we're talking about millions of dollars in gold, which means taxes in the hundreds of thousands. You'll also attract attention from people who think they deserve a share, from distant Brennan relatives who might contest your claim, from media who'll make this a story whether you want publicity or not. Julian felt the weight of this settling onto shoulders that were already carrying too much. What if I just quietly sold it? Avoided the attention? That's tax evasion and possibly handling stolen property if anyone questions the chain of ownership. You'd be risking federal prosecution. Marcus paused. Here's what I recommend. We establish your legal claim properly, file the necessary documentation with tax authorities, get everything above board before you touch the gold. It costs you money up front in taxes, but it protects you from problems that could take away everything you found. Over the next week, Marcus helped Julian navigate bureaucracy that seemed designed to make legitimate claims impossible. They documented the discovery, photographed the chamber and its contents, had the gold professionally appraised by a firm that specialized in historical bullion. The final count was staggering: 276 gold bars with a total weight of approximately 2,800 pounds, worth at current market prices roughly $48 million. $48 million. Julian sat with that number, tried to comprehend wealth that exceeded anything his family had possessed across generations, tried to process that he'd paid $395 for a foreclosed building and had found a fortune that would change not just his life but Mia's life and potentially the lives of people he hadn't even imagined helping yet. But the taxes were equally staggering. Federal and state obligations would consume approximately $18 million, leaving Julian with roughly $30 million after the government took its share. Still life-changing, still more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes of modest living, but also a reminder that found treasure came with obligations that couldn't be avoided. The news broke before Julian was ready, despite Marcus's efforts to keep the discovery quiet until legal claims were established. Someone at the appraiser's office talked to media, and within days Julian's story was everywhere. Broke single dad finds $48 million in gold beneath foreclosed pulp mill, hidden treasure discovered in abandoned building, Walter Brennan's fortune finally claimed after 90 years. The attention was overwhelming and invasive. Reporters camped outside Julian's apartment. Distant relatives of the Brennan family emerged claiming they deserved portions of the gold. People Julian had never met suddenly wanted to share in his good fortune. Mia's school became a circus of media and curiosity, forcing Julian to pull her out temporarily while they figured out how to handle publicity neither had wanted. But the attention also brought unexpected allies. A historian named Dr. Elizabeth Warren reached out, specializing in Depression-era economic history, fascinated by Walter Brennan's decision to convert wealth to gold and hide it rather than trust banks or leave it to his sons. She'd researched the Brennan family, had documentation that supported Walter's characterization of his sons as wastrels, had evidence that made Julian's legal claim even stronger. Walter Brennan was a fascinating figure, Dr. Warren explained during their first meeting. Self-made industrialist who built the pulp mill from nothing, who employed hundreds during the Depression when most businesses were failing, who was known for paying fair wages and treating workers decently. But his personal life was tragic. His wife died young, his sons proved themselves unreliable, and he died believing his life's work would be squandered by people who hadn't earned it. So he hid millions of dollars in gold beneath his mill and hoped someone worthy would find it? Exactly. It was both practical and symbolic. Practical because he didn't trust banks after the failures of 1929 to 1933, symbolic because he wanted wealth to go to someone who demonstrated the qualities his sons lacked. Dr. Warren paused. You finding it 90 years later, when you were desperate and working hard to salvage value from an abandoned building, that's exactly what Walter hoped would happen. The legal challenges came faster than Marcus had predicted. 3 separate groups of Brennan descendants filed claims, arguing that the gold should have been part of Walter's estate, that hiding it was fraud that invalidated Julian's claim, that family had rights to inheritance regardless of how much time had passed. The lawsuits were transparently motivated by greed rather than legitimate legal theory, but they still required expensive defense and created uncertainty about when Julian could actually access the fortune he'd found. Marcus was blunt about the situation. They're hoping to pressure you into settlement, to extract money through nuisance litigation even though their claims are weak. We can fight and probably win, but it'll cost you legal fees and time and stress. Or you can settle for amounts that make them go away, except that sometimes buying peace is cheaper than being right. Julian thought about this, about the principle of standing his ground versus the practical reality that he had $30 million and could afford to make problems disappear. What would Walter Brennan have done? From what Dr. Warren says, he would have fought on principle, would have refused to reward people who hadn't earned anything. But he also died bitter and alone, so maybe his approach wasn't optimal. Marcus leaned forward. Here's my advice. Offer each group $200,000 to settle all claims with prejudice. It's more than they deserve but less than fighting would cost you. You buy peace, you move on with your life, you don't spend the next 5 years in litigation. The settlements were finalized in March, 6 months after Julian had broken through the wall and found the hidden chamber. He'd paid out $600,000 total to make the Brennan descendants go away, had spent another $400,000 on legal fees and taxes and professional services. But the remaining $29 million was his, free and clear, legally established through documentation that protected him from future claims. The question became what to do with wealth that was both opportunity and burden. Julian could walk away from the pulp mill, could sell his salvage rights and never think about the building again, could use the money to create security for himself and Mia that would last lifetimes. But Walter Brennan's letter echoed in his mind, use it wisely, build something that matters, don't waste it the way my sons would have. Dr. Warren suggested an idea that had been forming in her research about Walter Brennan and the pulp mill's history. The building represents important industrial heritage. It's one of the last intact pulp mills from that era, shows construction techniques and equipment configurations that don't exist anywhere else. If you restored it properly, created a museum and educational center about paper production and industrial labor, you'd be honoring what Walter built while creating something meaningful for the community. Julian walked through the pulp mill with new eyes, seeing it not as salvage material but as potential, as something that could be preserved and repurposed, as a building that had given him fortune and maybe deserved investment in return. The structure was solid despite decades of neglect, its brick walls and timber framing built to last centuries, its spaces adaptable to uses Walter never imagined but might have appreciated. How much would restoration cost? Julian asked. $5 to $7 million for full historical restoration, probably another $2 million to create exhibits and educational programming, ongoing operational costs of maybe $300,000 annually. Dr. Warren paused. It's a significant investment, but you'd be creating something that preserves history while honoring the man whose fortune made it possible. And you'd still have $20 million left for yourself and Mia. The decision took weeks of careful thought, of conversations with Mia about what kind of life they wanted to build with wealth neither had expected, of weighing responsibility against freedom, obligation against opportunity. Finally, sitting in the pulp mill's main processing floor where machinery had once transformed timber into paper, Julian made his choice. We restore it. We build the museum. We honor what Walter created and make sure his story doesn't get lost. He looked at Mia, making sure she was part of this decision. But we do it right, take our time, create something that matters rather than just spending money because we can. The restoration began that summer, employing local contractors and craftspeople who remembered when the mill operated, who'd worked there or had family who'd worked there, who understood what the building represented. They worked carefully, preserving original elements while making the structure safe and functional, creating spaces that could house exhibits about paper production and industrial labor in the Depression-era economy that had shaped Walter Brennan's decisions. Dr. Warren curated the exhibits, telling the story of the pulp mill and its founder, showing how one man's determination and careful management had created employment and wealth during times when both were scarce. But the exhibits also told harder truths, about labor conditions and environmental impact, about the costs of industrialization and the communities built around single industries that eventually failed. And they told Walter's story completely, showing his letter and the gold chamber and the decision to hide fortune rather than leave it to unworthy heirs. The display was honest about his bitterness, about his failed relationship with his sons, about the fact that his solution, sealing away millions of dollars, was as much about control as about principle. He wasn't a perfect person, Dr. Warren explained during a planning meeting. He was brilliant and hardworking and generous to employees, but he was also controlling and judgmental and couldn't forgive his sons for being less than he wanted. The full story is more interesting than simple hero narrative, shows how complicated people can create both good and harm through the same decisions. Julian understood this complexity, recognized it in his own life and choices, in the way desperation and opportunity had collided to bring him to the pulp mill and the fortune hidden in its foundation. He wasn't a hero for finding the gold, just someone who'd been broke enough to buy salvage rights and thorough enough to break through walls. The fortune was luck mixed with work, circumstances meeting determination at the right moment. But how he used that fortune, what he built with resources he'd never expected, that was choice, was the measure of character Walter had been trying to test when he sealed the chamber and wrote his letter. Julian could waste it the way Gerald and Thomas Brennan had wasted their inheritance, could hoard it and live in isolated comfort, could spend without thought or purpose. Or he could build something that honored the trust Walter had placed in whoever found his hidden wealth. The Riverside Pulp Mill Museum opened 2 years after Julian had broken through the wall and found the chamber, its restoration complete, its exhibits comprehensive, its purpose clear. The building that had been foreclosed and abandoned, that Julian had bought for $395 intending to salvage for scrap, had been transformed into something that preserved history while serving education. The opening ceremony drew hundreds of people, historians and preservationists, former mill workers and their families, community members curious about the building's resurrection, media documenting the completion of a story that had captivated attention. Julian stood with Mia and Dr. Warren, watching people explore exhibits that told Walter Brennan's story and the broader story of industrial labor in rural communities. A descendant of one of the mill's original workers approached Julian, an elderly woman named Margaret Chin whose grandfather had worked for Walter Brennan during the Depression. "My grandfather always spoke highly of Mr. Brennan, said he was demanding but fair, paid wages when other mills were cutting or closing. Said working here kept our family fed through years when a lot of people were starving." "I'm glad the museum can honor that," Julian said. "It's important people understand what places like this meant to communities, how they shaped lives and created opportunity. My grandfather also said Mr. Brennan was a sad man, that his sons were a disappointment he couldn't get past, that he died bitter about family even though his business was successful." Margaret paused. "I think he would appreciate what you've done here, turning his mill into something that teaches instead of just preserves. That's better than leaving money to people who'd waste it." The years that followed brought stability Julian had never experienced in his adult life. The museum operated sustainably, drew visitors interested in industrial history and Depression-era economics, employed local people as guides and educators and maintenance staff. Julian managed it with the same careful attention Walter Brennan had applied to the pulp mill itself, understanding that wealth required stewardship, that resources were responsibility as much as freedom. He and Mia lived modestly despite the millions in the bank, had chosen a comfortable house rather than a mansion, had built a life defined by purpose rather than consumption. Mia attended good schools, had opportunities Walter's gold had funded, but also had chores and expectations and understanding that wealth was privilege requiring responsibility. On quiet evenings, Julian would sometimes walk through the museum after it closed, moving through exhibits that told stories about labor and industry and the complicated man who'd built this place 90 years ago. He'd stand in front of the gold chamber display, looking at the photograph of Walter Brennan and reading the letter that had changed everything, thinking about the chain of events that had brought him here. A foreclosure auction and $395. A desperate need for salvage income. A wall that sounded hollow. Stairs descending into darkness. Gold bars wrapped in cloth, waiting patiently for someone to find them. And a letter from a dead man trusting that whoever discovered his hidden fortune would prove themselves worthy through the simple act of being willing to work hard enough to search thoroughly. Julian had been that person not through virtue but through desperation, had found the gold not through cleverness but through circumstances that made him thorough when others might have been satisfied with surface salvage. But what he'd done afterward, that was choice, was character, was the demonstration that Walter had been trying to test for when he sealed the chamber and wrote his letter. Use it wisely. Build something that matters. Don't waste it the way my sons would have. Julian had tried to honor those instructions, had invested Walter's fortune in preserving what Walter had built, had created something educational and meaningful rather than just converting gold to personal luxury. The museum would outlast him, would continue teaching long after he was gone, would preserve not just Walter Brennan's story but the broader history of industrial labor and the communities built around work that eventually became obsolete. Mia grew into a young woman shaped by the experience of finding fortune and watching her father choose stewardship over consumption, purpose over comfort. She studied history and economics, wanted to understand the systems that created poverty and wealth, wanted to build something that addressed inequality rather than just benefiting from lucky discovery. The gold had given her opportunities, but it had also given her questions about fairness and luck and the fact that her father had found millions while other equally deserving people found nothing. "You could have kept it all," she said one evening when she was 18, both of them walking through the museum after a school group had toured. "Could have lived like billionaires, never worked again, just enjoyed the money." "I could have," Julian agreed. But Walter's letter was clear: use it wisely, build something that matters. Hoarding it for ourselves would have been wasting it, just in a different way than his sons would have. This museum, this preservation of history, this employment of local people, it matters more than another mansion I don't need. But we still have millions. We're still wealthy by any normal measure. Yeah, we are. And that creates responsibility, to use it well, to remember that finding it was luck more than merit, to honor the trust Walter placed in whoever discovered his gold." Julian paused. "Money can build or it can corrupt. The choice is ours every day." 5 years after finding the gold, 10 years after buying the pulp mill for salvage, Julian received an unexpected letter. It was from a man named Robert Brennan, great-grandson of Thomas Brennan, one of Walter's wastrel sons. He'd been 12 when the gold was discovered, had watched from distance as various family members had sued Julian for shares they didn't deserve, had been embarrassed by the greed displayed by relatives he barely knew. Now 22 and recently graduated from college, Robert had questions about his great-great-grandfather and the family history he'd never fully understood. He wanted to visit the museum, wanted to learn about Walter Brennan from sources more reliable than family mythology, wanted to understand the man whose hidden gold had funded the preservation of his legacy. Julian invited him to visit, both of them walking through exhibits that told Walter's story with honesty rather than hagiography. Robert was quiet as he read about his great-great-grandfather's brilliance and bitterness, about the sons who'd disappointed him, about the decision to hide wealth rather than trust family. "My grandfather, Thomas Brennan's son, always spoke about the family losing everything, about inheritance that was stolen or hidden," Robert said finally. He blamed Walter for not trusting his sons, blamed the system for letting treasure go to strangers instead of family. But reading this, seeing the evidence of how Gerald and Thomas wasted what they did inherit, I understand why Walter made the choice he made. "It's a sad story," Julian said. "A man who built something remarkable but died bitter because his family couldn't meet his standards. Not exactly heroic, but very human. What you've built here, though, preserving his mill, telling his story, creating something educational, that's what he hoped would happen. Better than his sons would have done, better than I think even he imagined when he sealed that chamber." Robert paused. "Thank you for honoring him this way. For not just taking the money and disappearing." After Robert left, Julian stood in the museum thinking about legacy and inheritance, about the complicated ways wealth passed between generations and the equally complicated ways it shaped the people who received it. Walter Brennan had tried to control the future by hiding his fortune, by creating a test that whoever found it would have to pass through sheer perseverance and determination. Julian had passed that test through desperation rather than virtue, but had then faced his own test: what to do with wealth that was both opportunity and responsibility. The museum was his answer, was the choice to build rather than consume, to preserve rather than waste, to honor trust placed in him by a man who died decades before Julian was born. It wasn't perfect, nothing human ever was, but it was meaningful, was substantial, was the kind of legacy that mattered beyond bank balances and personal comfort. 20 years after finding the gold, Julian stood in the pulp mill watching his daughter Mia give a tour to visiting students, explaining Walter Brennan's story and the broader context of industrial labor in the Depression era. She joined the museum staff full-time after graduate school, had taken over much of the educational programming, had expanded exhibits to address questions about labor conditions and environmental impact and the lasting consequences of industrial decline. She was explaining the gold chamber to students who were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the idea of hiding millions of dollars beneath a building. Walter Brennan made this choice because he didn't trust banks and he didn't trust his sons, Mia said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd spent years thinking about this story. It was both practical and symbolic: practical because banks had failed during the Depression, symbolic because he wanted to test whoever found his wealth, to make sure they'd earned it through work. But that's not fair, one student objected. Just because his sons were irresponsible doesn't mean they didn't deserve inheritance. You're right, it's not entirely fair, Mia agreed. Walter was controlling and judgmental, let his disappointment in his children poison his final years. But he also built something remarkable, employed hundreds of people during hard times, created wealth through honest work. The full story is complicated. He was both brilliant and bitter, generous and controlling. Understanding that complexity is what history does. Julian watched his daughter teach, feeling the weight of 20 years settle into something approaching contentment. The gold had changed their lives, had transformed desperation into security, had created opportunities neither had imagined when Julian was buying foreclosed buildings for salvage and hoping to extract enough value to pay rent. But the real transformation had been in the choices that followed discovery, in the decision to build something meaningful rather than just consume wealth that had arrived through lucky accident. The museum would outlast him, would continue its work long after Julian was gone, would preserve Walter Brennan's story and the broader industrial history it represented. That was legacy, not hoarding what you'd found, but investing it in something larger than yourself, something that served education and preservation and community rather than just personal comfort. The land had held its secrets for 90 years, the pulp mill standing through decades of operation and abandonment, the chamber sealed beneath its foundation waiting patiently for someone to break through walls and descend stairs and discover what Walter had hidden. Julian had been that person through a combination of desperation and thoroughness, through circumstances that made him look where others hadn't, through need that drove him to extract value from a building the world had abandoned. But finding the gold was just the beginning. What he'd built afterward, the museum, the preservation, the choice to honor trust rather than waste fortune, that was the real story, the part that mattered beyond lucky discovery. Walter Brennan had hoped whoever found his wealth would prove themselves worthy through how they used it. Julian had tried to meet that standard, had invested millions in preserving what Walter built, had created something educational and meaningful that would serve generations beyond his own. As evening settled over the museum and the last visitors departed, Julian walked through the building one final time before locking up. The exhibits glowed under careful lighting, the stories they told preserved in photographs and artifacts and interpretive text that gave context to history that might otherwise be forgotten. The gold chamber display showed the bars as they'd been found, wrapped in cloth, stacked in crates, waiting in darkness for revelation that came 90 years after they were hidden. He stopped at Walter Brennan's letter, displayed behind glass, its fountain pen handwriting still clear despite the decades. Use it wisely. Build something that matters. Simple instructions, but profound in their implication that wealth was responsibility, that fortune found required stewardship, that lucky accidents created obligations beyond personal benefit. Julian had tried to honor those instructions, had built something he believed Walter would recognize as worthy, had transformed hidden gold into preserved heritage. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it mattered, was substantial, was the kind of legacy that transcended the individual luck that had brought him to this place. The pulp mill stood solid in the darkness, its brick walls holding stories that spanned a century, its spaces filled with exhibits that educated rather than just preserved. The building that had been foreclosed and abandoned, that Julian had purchased for $395 planning to demolish for salvage, had been reborn through wealth it had hidden in choices that had followed discovery. That was enough. More than enough. It was fortune used wisely, was something built that mattered, was wealth transformed from personal windfall to community resource. Walter Brennan had trusted that whoever found his gold would understand responsibility that came with discovery. Julian had spent 20 years trying to meet that trust, building something that honored not just Walter's legacy but the broader principle that some gifts required giving forward rather than hoarding for personal benefit. The museum would continue long after Julian was gone, would teach and preserve and honor, would stand as testament to the fact that sometimes desperate gambles made by broke people led to discoveries that changed everything, and that what mattered most wasn't the finding but the building that followed, the choices made when fortune arrived unexpected and overwhelming and full of possibility for either waste or wisdom. The months between finding the gold and establishing legal claim had been harder than Julian admitted to most people. The $18 million in taxes had to be paid before he could access the remaining $30 million, which meant he'd found a fortune but couldn't touch it while rent was still due and Mia still needed to eat and the truck's transmission was still making concerning noises. Marcus had arranged a bridge loan using the gold as collateral, but banks were cautious about lending against assets tied up in legal proceedings, and the terms were expensive. Julian had continued salvaging the accessible parts of the pulp mill during those months, selling copper wire and cast iron for amounts that seemed pathetic compared to the gold sealed in the basement but which still meant the difference between keeping their apartment and losing it. The irony wasn't lost on him, sitting on $48 million in gold while scrapping metal to make rent, wealthy on paper but broke in practice, counting down days until legal processes would release wealth he'd already found. Mia had handled the uncertainty with the resilience she developed through years of instability, but Julian could see the strain. She was 10 years old and shouldn't have to worry about whether they'd have housing next month, shouldn't have to watch her father work 16-hour days extracting salvage value from a building that held millions they couldn't access. The waiting felt cruel, a test of patience that extended Walter Brennan's challenge beyond the simple act of finding hidden wealth. The turning point came in February when the final legal claims were settled and the IRS accepted their tax payment plan. Suddenly, the remaining $29 million became accessible, became real money Julian could deposit and use and build with rather than theoretical wealth locked behind bureaucracy. The first thing he did was pay off every debt, the bridge loan, the medical bills from Mia's appendectomy 2 years prior, the credit cards he'd been juggling, the back rent he'd negotiated payment plans for. The second thing was take Mia shopping for clothes that actually fit and winter gear that wasn't threadbare. They'd stood in the department store, Mia trying on coats that were warm and new, and she'd asked quietly, "Can we really afford this now? You're not going to have to return it later?" The question had broken Julian's heart, revealing how deeply financial instability had shaped his daughter's understanding of what was possible. "We can afford it," he'd said, kneeling to her level. "We can afford this and a lot more. That part of our life is over." But even as he said it, Julian understood that simply having money didn't erase the psychology of poverty, didn't undo years of calculating every purchase and choosing between necessities because buying both wasn't possible. He caught himself still checking prices obsessively, still feeling guilty about spending even small amounts, still operating with the scarcity mindset that had defined his adult life. Wealth was a fact, but feeling wealthy was a process that would take longer than legal proceedings. Dr. Warren had become more than a historical consultant during the museum planning phase. She'd grown into something like a friend, someone who understood the weight of what Julian was trying to build and who brought expertise he lacked. She'd worked in museum curation for 20 years, had connections throughout the historical preservation community, had the kind of credibility that opened doors Julian couldn't have accessed alone. The challenge with industrial museums is making them relevant to people who don't care about machinery, she'd explained during an early planning session. You can't just preserve equipment and expect visitors to understand why it matters. You have to tell human stories, show how industrial processes shaped communities and lives, make it personal rather than just technical. They developed exhibits that wove together machinery and humanity, that showed the pulp mill's paper production process alongside photographs of workers and their families, that explained economic forces while making clear those forces affected real people with names and faces. One exhibit followed 3 generations of the Chen family who'd worked at the mill from its opening in 1923 through its closure in 1985, showing how industrial employment had shaped their lives and opportunities and eventual displacement when the mill became obsolete. Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who'd attended the opening, had donated family photographs and documents that made the exhibit powerful, images of her grandfather standing proud in his work clothes, paycheck stubs showing wages that had kept the family fed during the Depression, a letter from Walter Brennan commending her father's 25 years of service. The materials transformed abstract labor history into specific human experience, showed what the pulp mill had meant to people for whom it was employer and community center and source of identity. "My grandfather believed in honest work," Margaret had said while reviewing the exhibit before opening. "Believed that if you showed up and did your job well, you'd be treated fairly. Walter Brennan honored that belief, paid decent wages when he could have paid less, kept people employed when other mills were cutting staff. My family owes him a debt we could never repay." Julian had struggled with this characterization, with the hero worship that ignored Walter's flaws and complicated motivations. He also died bitter and alone because he couldn't forgive his sons for being less than perfect. That's not exactly admirable. No, but it's human. People contain contradictions. They can be generous employers and terrible fathers, brilliant businessmen and controlling patriarchs. Understanding the full person matters more than simple hero stories. Margaret had paused, looking at the exhibit. You're doing right by him here, showing both sides, letting people draw their own conclusions. The museum's opening had drawn unexpected attention from labor historians and economists studying Depression-era industrial management. Walter Brennan's decision to pay above-market wages during the 1930s, to maintain employment when cutting staff would have been more profitable, had been unusual enough to warrant academic interest. Dr. Warren had found correspondence between Walter and other mill owners, letters where he'd argued that keeping workers employed created stability that benefited everyone, that short-term profit maximization damaged long-term sustainability. Brennan understood something most industrialists didn't, wrote one historian in an article about the museum. That labor wasn't just a cost to be minimized but an investment in community stability and productive capacity. He paid well because it made business sense, not just because it was morally right. The Pulp mill's longevity, 62 years of continuous operation, suggests his approach worked. But the letters also revealed Walter's paternalism, his belief that workers needed guidance and structure, his conviction that he knew better than they did what was good for them. He'd opposed union organizing, had fired workers who tried to organize collective bargaining, had maintained control through a combination of fair wages and authoritarian management. The full picture was complicated, showed a man whose generosity came with strings, whose fairness was conditional on deference to his authority. Julian had insisted these contradictions be displayed honestly, had pushed back against Dr. Warren's initial tendency to soften the rough edges of Walter's character. People aren't simple, he'd argued. Walter did good things and controlling things, was generous and authoritarian. If we only show the good, we're lying. If we only show the bad, we're equally dishonest. The truth is both. The exhibit that emerged showed Walter Brennan in full complexity, his innovative business practices alongside his paternalistic management, his fair wages alongside his anti-union positions, his care for workers' material conditions alongside his insistence on their absolute deference. Visitors could admire his achievements while questioning his methods, could appreciate his impact while recognizing his flaws. As the museum entered its third year of operation, Julian began receiving letters from people whose lives had been touched by the pulp mill's closure. Former workers who'd been displaced when the mill shut down in 1985, who'd struggled to find comparable employment, whose families had been shaped by the economic disruption that followed. Many were angry, felt abandoned by a system that had used their labor and then discarded them when foreign competition made local production unprofitable. One letter came from a man named Robert Wilson, whose father had worked at the mill for 38 years before the closure. "My dad never recovered," Robert wrote. He was 54 when they shut down, too old to retrain for new industries, too young to retire. He worked odd jobs for the rest of his life, never earned more than minimum wage, died believing he was worthless because the only skill he had, pulp processing, wasn't needed anymore. The mill gave him identity and purpose, and taking that away destroyed something in him that never healed. Julian had read the letter multiple times, feeling the weight of grief that couldn't be fixed by museum exhibits or historical preservation. The pulp mill represented different things to different people. For some it was heritage worth preserving, for others it was the site of abandonment and economic betrayal, for still others it was both simultaneously, complicated and painful and irreducible to simple narratives. He'd invited Robert to visit, had listened to stories about a father who'd taken pride in his work, who'd believed loyalty to employer would be reciprocated with security, who'd been devastated when global economic forces rendered his skills obsolete. They'd walked through exhibits together, Robert pointing out photographs where his father appeared in group shots of mill workers, sharing memories that weren't in any historical record. "What you've built here is important," Robert had said finally. "It preserves something that mattered, honors the work people did even if that work eventually became obsolete." But it also hurts, seeing it turned into a museum, seeing my father's workplace treated as history rather than living employment. That probably sounds ungrateful. No, it sounds honest. Julian had paused, trying to find words for something he was still working through himself. The museum can't fix what happened when the mill closed, can't restore jobs or give back what people lost. All it can do is remember, is say that the work mattered and the workers mattered and the community that built itself around this place deserved dignity even when economic forces made it obsolete. Robert had nodded, accepting this limitation while clearly carrying grief that preservation couldn't heal. My dad would have appreciated being remembered. That's something, at least. The conversation had stayed with Julian, had complicated his understanding of what the museum represented and for whom. He'd been focused on honoring Walter Brennan's legacy, on preserving industrial heritage, on creating educational value. But for people like Robert Wilson, the museum was also a memorial to loss, a reminder of security that had been promised and then withdrawn, a monument to an economic system that had used people and then discarded them. Dr. Warren had helped develop an additional exhibit addressing this dimension, when the mill closed, showing photographs and oral histories from workers displaced by the 1985 shutdown, documenting the economic impact on families and community, acknowledging that industrial heritage included not just achievement but also abandonment. The exhibit didn't shy away from difficult truths about capitalism and creative destruction and the human cost of economic efficiency. This is the part most industrial museums avoid, Dr. Warren had said while reviewing the exhibit materials. They want to celebrate innovation and productivity, don't want to address what happened when those innovations made workers obsolete. But that's half the story, and pretending it doesn't exist is dishonest. The museum's fourth year brought unexpected challenges. A developer approached Julian with an offer to buy the Pulp mill property for $8 million. Wanted to demolish the museum and build luxury condominiums on the riverside land. The offer was substantial, more than Julian had invested in restoration, more than the property's assessed value, enough to make walking away financially attractive. But accepting would mean destroying what he'd built, would mean converting Walter Brennan's legacy back into profit rather than preservation, would mean choosing personal gain over community resource. Julian struggled with the decision, recognizing that he had every legal right to sell, that nobody could fault him for taking $8 million, that the museum had succeeded in its mission even if it closed after 4 years. Mia was 14 by then, old enough to have opinions about decisions that affected their family. You could sell, she'd said when Julian explained the offer. Take the money, close the museum, move somewhere else and never think about pulp mills again. That would be the easy choice. But you didn't build this to be easy. You built it because Walter Brennan trusted whoever found his gold would use it wisely, would build something that mattered. Selling to a developer who'll tear it down for condos, that's not using it wisely. That's just converting one form of money to another. Julian had looked at his daughter, seeing wisdom that came from growing up in proximity to difficult choices, from watching her father try to honor principles that cost more than convenience justified. You're right. But turning down $8 million feels insane when we could use that money for your education, for security, for all kinds of legitimate needs. We already have security. We have more money than we'll ever spend from the gold that's left. 8 million more doesn't change anything except making us richer people who destroyed something important for profit. Mia had paused. That's exactly what Walter Brennan's sons would have done. And you're not them. The developer had been incredulous when Julian declined, had increased the offer to 10 million, then 12, seemingly unable to believe anyone would refuse that much money for a building that was just sitting there as a museum. But Julian had held firm, had recognized that some things weren't for sale at any price, that the museum represented obligations that transcended market value. The decision had consequences. The developer had gone to the county arguing that the museum wasn't generating sufficient tax revenue, that the property should be rezoned for residential development, that preserving one old building shouldn't prevent economic growth that would benefit the whole community. The fight had required legal representation and political advocacy, had cost Julian time and money and stress that accepting the offer would have avoided. But it had also revealed community support he hadn't anticipated. Former mill workers and their families had shown up at zoning hearings arguing for preservation, had testified that the museum mattered as memorial and education, had pushed back against the idea that everything should be sacrificed to development and profit. Teachers had brought students to speak about what they'd learned from visiting, about how the museum made history tangible rather than abstract. The county had ultimately sided with preservation, had denied the rezoning request, had acknowledged that some buildings carried historical and educational value that justified protecting them from development pressure. The developer had walked away angry, but the museum had survived, had proven itself worth defending not just to Julian but to a community that recognized its importance. Dr. Warren had documented the fight as part of the museum's ongoing story, had created an exhibit about preservation battles and community values and the tension between economic development and historical memory. "This is part of your legacy too," she'd told Julian. "Not just building the museum, but fighting to keep it when selling would have been easier and more profitable. That matters." By the museum's 7th year, Mia was 17 and preparing for college. She'd grown up in the museum's shadow, had spent countless hours exploring its exhibits and helping with educational programs, had developed deep knowledge of industrial history and labor economics and the complicated relationship between capitalism and community. She'd decided to study history and museum studies, wanted to build a career in preservation and public history, had been shaped by watching her father transform found fortune into educational resource. "I could study anything," she'd told Julian while reviewing college applications. "The gold means I don't have to worry about earning potential or job security. I can pursue what actually interests me instead of what pays best." "That's a gift Walter Brennan gave you through the fortune he hid," Julian had said. "Freedom to build a life around meaning instead of just survival. That's worth more than the dollar amount. But it also creates responsibility, right? If I have this freedom because someone 90 years ago made choices that eventually led to us, then I should use that freedom for something that matters, not just for personal enjoyment." Julian had recognized his own thinking in his daughter's words, had seen how the experience of finding wealth had shaped both their understandings of what fortune meant and what obligations it created. You don't owe anyone specific outcomes. But yeah, using advantages wisely probably matters more than just using them selfishly. Mia had been accepted to several prestigious universities, had chosen one with a strong public history program, had left for college carrying both the security of Walter Brennan's gold and the understanding that wealth created responsibilities she was still figuring out how to meet. Julian had driven her to campus feeling the peculiar mixture of pride and loss that comes from watching children grow into independent people, from recognizing that she didn't need him the way she had when she was 7 and they'd had $32 between them. The museum continued its work through her college years, Julian managing operations while developing new exhibits and programs, slowly expanding the scope beyond just the pulp mill to address broader questions about industrial labor and economic change. He'd hired a small staff, educators and maintenance workers and administrators, creating employment that honored Walter Brennan's belief that businesses should serve community needs alongside profit. One staff member was James Wilson, Robert Wilson's nephew, who'd grown up hearing stories about the mill and his great-grandfather's displacement when it closed. James had studied engineering but had struggled to find work in a region where industrial employment had mostly disappeared, had taken the museum job partly from necessity but also from connection to the place his family history was bound up with. "It's strange working here," James had told Julian during their first month. "My great-grandfather spent 38 years processing pulp in this building, and now I'm giving tours and maintaining exhibits about the work he did. It feels both right and weird simultaneously." "History always feels that way when it's personal," Julian had said. "When it's just facts about strangers, it's easy to be objective. When it's your family, when it's places you remember or people you knew, objectivity gets complicated by emotion." James had become one of the museum's most effective educators, bringing personal connection that made industrial history feel immediate rather than distant. He'd interviewed his grandfather and other former workers, had collected oral histories that captured dimensions of mill life that didn't appear in official records, had helped develop exhibits that showed work as workers experienced it rather than just as management documented it. The museum's 10th anniversary brought reflection on what had been built and what remained unfinished. Julian was 42 now, no longer the desperate 32-year-old who'd bought the pulp mill for salvage, his life transformed by a combination of luck and choice and the determination to honor trust placed in him by a dead man's letter. The museum was stable and respected, drew steady visitors and served educational purposes, had proven itself valuable to a community that had initially been skeptical about preserving an abandoned industrial building. But Julian also recognized limitations. The museum told important stories but couldn't restore lost jobs, preserved history but couldn't prevent economic forces that made that history feel distant and irrelevant to people struggling in the present. The pulp mill operated in 1923 because it created employment and produced goods people needed. The museum operated in 2024 because it educated and memorialized, serving different purposes than the building had originally been designed for. Dr. Warren, now 72 and considering retirement, had become a trusted advisor and friend over the decade they'd worked together. "You've honored Walter Brennan's trust," she'd told Julian during a quiet conversation after the anniversary celebration. "Built something meaningful, preserved important history, created educational value that will outlast both of us." That's what he hoped would happen when he sealed that chamber. But it doesn't fix what happened when the mill closed, doesn't restore what people like Robert Wilson's father lost. Sometimes preservation feels like we're just making loss look respectable instead of actually addressing it. You can't fix the past. You can only remember it honestly and try to learn from it. Elizabeth had paused. The museum matters because it refuses to pretend industrial work was simple or purely good or that closure was purely tragic. It shows complexity, honors the people involved while acknowledging the forces that shaped their lives. That's valuable even if it doesn't solve current economic problems. Mia returned after college with her degree in museum studies and a job offer from a major institution in another city. She'd been offered good money and prestigious work, the kind of career that would have been impossible without the security Walter Brennan's gold had provided. But she'd surprised Julian by turning it down, by choosing instead to come back to the Pulp Mill Museum and continue the work they'd started together. The offer was tempting, she'd explained. Major institution, important collections, all the prestige and resources I could want. But it felt disconnected from what actually matters to me. This place, this museum, this story we're telling, it's personal in ways that make it mean more than professional advancement. Julian had understood the impulse while worrying about what she might be sacrificing. You could build an important career elsewhere. You don't have to limit yourself to one museum in a small town just because we have history with it. I'm not limiting myself. I'm choosing what matters to me over what looks impressive to other people. That's freedom, Dad. That's using the advantages the gold gave us to build a life around meaning instead of just credentialing. Mia had smiled. Besides, there's more work to do here. More stories to tell, more connections to build, more ways to make this place relevant to people who think industrial history is boring. She'd brought fresh energy and new ideas, had expanded educational programming to include workshops on labor organizing and economic justice, had developed partnerships with schools and community organizations, had made the museum feel less like a shrine to the past and more like a resource for understanding present challenges. Under her direction, exhibits began addressing contemporary questions about automation and globalization and the displacement of workers by forces beyond their control. One exhibit she developed particularly resonated with visitors. Then and now, workers displaced drew parallels between mill workers laid off in 1985 and contemporary workers displaced by technology and outsourcing, showing that the fundamental challenge, what happens to people when their skills become obsolete, hadn't changed even as the specific industries and mechanisms evolved. The exhibit asked difficult questions about whether society owed displaced workers anything beyond unemployment benefits, whether communities had obligations to people whose labor had built them, whether economic efficiency justified the human cost of creative destruction. We can't just celebrate industrial heritage without addressing what happened when that heritage became obsolete, Mia had explained during the exhibit's opening. The pulp mill employed hundreds, created community, gave people identity and purpose. When it closed, all of that disappeared, and we collectively decided that was just how capitalism worked, that nobody bore responsibility for the aftermath. This exhibit asks whether that's good enough, whether we can do better. The museum's 15th anniversary coincided with economic downturn hitting the region, with several major employers closing or relocating, with unemployment rising and familiar patterns of displacement repeating themselves. The museum became unexpectedly relevant, a place where people could see their current struggles reflected in historical experience, could understand they weren't the first to face obsolescence and abandonment, could find some small comfort in knowing that previous generations had survived similar disruptions. Julian found himself giving more talks to community groups, sharing Walter Brennan's story and his own experience of finding fortune in an abandoned building, trying to articulate lessons about resilience and adaptation and the importance of building something meaningful when circumstances allowed. He wasn't particularly eloquent, wasn't comfortable with public speaking, but people seemed to respond to authenticity, to a man who'd been broke enough to understand desperation and lucky enough to find a way out. "I bought this building for $395 because I was desperate," he'd say during these talks. "Needed salvage income to pay rent I couldn't afford, needed copper wire and scrap metal more than I needed industrial heritage. Finding the gold was pure luck, being in the right place at the right time, being thorough enough to break through walls others had assumed were solid." But what came after, the choice to build this museum instead of just keeping the money, that was decision rather than luck. That's the part that matters most. Audiences would ask variations of the same question: how did you know what to do with the money? How did you choose building the museum over just being rich? "I didn't know," Julian would answer honestly. "I struggled with it, questioned it, sometimes still wonder if I made the right choice." But Walter Brennan's letter was clear: use it wisely, build something that matters. Just keeping the money for personal luxuries seemed like wasting it, like being the sons he'd called wastrels. The museum isn't perfect, doesn't solve all problems, but it's substantial, it serves purposes beyond just making me comfortable. That felt like honoring his trust. By the 20th anniversary, the museum had become an established institution, part of the region's cultural infrastructure, recognized beyond its local community as a model for how industrial heritage could be preserved and made relevant. Dr. Warren had fully retired by then, but she attended the anniversary celebration, walking through exhibits she'd helped develop, seeing how they'd evolved under Mia's direction. "You and Mia built something remarkable here," Elizabeth said, both of them standing in the gold chamber exhibit that showed how everything had started. Walter Brennan hoped whoever found his fortune would prove worthy through how they used it. "I think he'd be satisfied with what you've created." Julian looked at the photograph of Walter, at the stern face of a man who'd died bitter and alone, who'd hidden millions because he couldn't trust his family, who'd placed faith in strangers who wouldn't exist for decades after his death. "I hope so. But I also think he'd see the contradictions, would recognize that preserving his mill doesn't fix the damage his industry did, that honoring workers doesn't restore jobs they lost, that museums are complicated answers to complicated problems." "Nothing human is simple," Elizabeth agreed. "But choosing complicated engagement over simple withdrawal, choosing to build something public over just hoarding private wealth, that matters. That's the difference between wisdom and waste." The museum continued into its third decade, Julian now in his 50s, Mia in her 30s, both of them carrying forward work that had begun with a desperate salvage purchase in a hidden chamber. The gold that had funded everything was mostly spent now, invested in the building's restoration, in endowments that funded operations, in programs and exhibits, in the steady work of preservation and education. What remained provided security but not extravagance, comfort but not luxury, exactly the kind of modest wealth Walter Brennan had probably intended when he'd written about using fortune wisely. On quiet evenings, Julian would sometimes walk through the museum alone, moving through spaces that had been crime scene and construction project and finally memorial to both achievement and loss. He'd stand in the gold chamber exhibit, looking at the bars that had changed his life, thinking about the chain of events that had brought him here: foreclosure and desperation, a wall that sounded hollow, stairs descending into darkness, a letter from a dead man trusting that whoever found his hidden fortune would prove themselves worthy. He'd been worthy not through virtue but through choice, through the determination to honor trust rather than waste fortune, through years of careful stewardship that had transformed personal windfall into community resource. The museum would outlast him, would continue its work long after he was gone, would preserve Walter Brennan's story and the broader industrial history it represented. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy built through choice rather than inherited through accident, was wealth used wisely rather than squandered carelessly, was something that mattered beyond bank balances and personal comfort. Julian had stumbled into fortune through desperation and luck, but what he'd built afterward, that was character, was the demonstration that Walter had been hoping for when he sealed the chamber and wrote his letter. The land had held its secrets for 90 years, the pulp mill standing through operation in abandonment, the chamber sealed beneath its foundation waiting patiently for someone to discover what Walter had hidden. Julian had been that person through circumstances beyond his control, but what he'd done with discovery, that was within his control, was the choice that defined him more than the lucky accident of finding gold beneath a building he'd bought for salvage. The museum stood in the darkness, its exhibits glowing under careful lighting, its stories preserved for whoever came seeking to understand how industrial labor had shaped communities and lives, how economic forces had created and then destroyed employment, how one man's fortune had funded the preservation of history he'd helped create. The building breathed with purpose, alive with meaning that transcended its original function, serving education where it had once served production. And in the gold chamber beneath it all, empty now except for photographs and documentation, the space where Walter Brennan had hidden his fortune waited as testament to the faith he'd placed in strangers, to the trust that someone worthy would eventually find what he'd sealed away, to the hope that wealth could build rather than corrupt when it found the right steward. Julian had tried to be that steward, had spent 25 years honoring obligations that came with fortune, had built something that served purposes beyond personal benefit. The museum was his answer to Walter's letter, was the choice to preserve rather than consume, to build rather than waste, to honor trust placed in him by a man who'd died decades before Julian was born. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you found but what you built, not what you inherited but what you chose to preserve, not what served you but what served something larger than yourself. The pulp mill had given Julian fortune he'd never expected, and he'd given back something that honored both the building and the man who'd built it, something that transformed hidden gold into preserved heritage and private windfall into public resource. The work would continue after he was gone, carried forward by Mia and whoever came after her, by people who understood that some discoveries created obligations that transcended personal benefit, that some inheritances came with responsibilities that required building rather than simply consuming. The museum stood as proof that buried things eventually surfaced, that trust eventually found worthy recipients, that fortune used wisely could create value far beyond the monetary worth of gold bars hidden in darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.